In 2024, the country of South Korea had a fertility rate of 0.75 children per woman. The number sounds technical until you understand what it means. For every 100 South Koreans alive today, there will be roughly 36 children in the next generation. The generation after that will be smaller still. The country's population, which peaked above 52 million, is projected to fall to around 22 million by the end of this century. South Korea will lose more than half its people in less than 80 years, simply because South Koreans are choosing not to have children. The South Korean government has spent over $270 billion trying to reverse this. Cash bonuses for newborns, housing subsidies, tax breaks, extended parental leave. They proposed exempting men from mandatory military service if they had 3 children before the age of 30. They even created an entire government ministry dedicated to population strategy. It is not working. South Korea is the most extreme case, but it is not alone. Japan has been shrinking for 15 years. China's population is now falling. Italy, Germany, Spain, Greece, Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, all below replacement. The United States is at 1.6 and dropping. India dropped below replacement in 2020. Even Iran is now below replacement. More than half the countries on Earth, representing most of human civilization, are now reproducing at rates that guarantee population decline within a century. This feels uniquely modern. The product of smartphones, careerism, social media, the impossible cost of housing. A crisis of the present moment. It isn't. 2,000 years ago, an empire faced exactly the same problem. It tried exactly the same solutions. And the man at the center of it discovered, the hard way, that you cannot legislate people back into having children. This is if it happens today. The Roman Empire of the 1st century BC was the most powerful state in the ancient world. It had defeated Carthage and conquered Greece. They had absorbed Egypt, Spain, and most of what we now call France. By the time the man who became Augustus took power in 27 BC, Rome ruled roughly 50 million people and stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf. It was also dying from the top down. The Roman elite, the senators, the equestrians, the families that had run the republic for centuries, had stopped having children. Where the great Roman matriarch Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, had borne 12 children in the 2nd century BC, the typical late Republican aristocratic family produced 2, sometimes 1, sometimes none. Senators were dying without heirs. Old family names were going extinct. Estates were passing to distant cousins, freed slaves, or the state. The reasons? Roman elites were urban. They lived in cities, not on farms. Children were expensive. They required tutors, dowries, political connections, and careers to be launched. The Roman world had become, by the standards of the ancient world, prosperous and individualistic. Wealthy Romans could divorce easily. Women had more legal autonomy than in almost any other ancient culture. The path of remaining unmarried or married without children was open and increasingly popular. The historian Tacitus, writing a century later, would describe Romans of this period choosing childlessness deliberately. They preferred their freedom and travel. They preferred their property to remain in their own hands rather than be diluted by inheritance among multiple sons. They did the math, and the math said, fewer children or none. Augustus looked at this trend and saw the end of Rome. He was, by ancient standards, a careful student of demographic data. He knew the senatorial class was contracting and the equestrians were following. He knew the army recruited from these classes, and the administrative state depended on them. A Rome with no senators would have no Senate. and a Rome with no equestrians would have no officers. An empire that could not reproduce its own ruling class would eventually cease to be an empire. So he did what powerful men do when they face problems they cannot solve. He passed a law. In 18 BC, Augustus enacted the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, the Julian law on the marrying of the orders. The law required senators and equestrians, the top two tiers of Roman society, to marry. Unmarried men between 25 and 60 and unmarried women between 20 and 50 would lose their right to receive inheritances. They would be barred from attending public games and certain religious festivals. Their political careers would stall. Their estates, on death, would revert to the state. To balance the penalties, the law offered rewards. Fathers of 3 children received expedited political advancement. Mothers of 3 children gained financial independence from their male guardians, a meaningful liberation in Roman law. Fathers of large families could claim exemption from certain public obligations. The famous Jus Trium Liberorum, the right of 3 children, became a coveted social status. A few years later, Augustus would add the Lex Julia de Adulteris, which made adultery a public crime. Wives who slept with men other than their husbands could be exiled. Husbands who failed to divorce adulterous wives could be prosecuted. The laws were not received well. Roman elites resisted them immediately. Some held public protests. Equestrian families petitioned for exemptions. Senators who happened to be over 60 or under 25 used the age windows to escape the requirements. Lawyers found loopholes, engagements that could be extended indefinitely, sham marriages, fictitious adoptions. The historian Suetonius records that when Augustus tried to enforce the laws at a public event, the equestrians in the audience began chanting and waving fingers at him in protest. The law produced one famous casualty. Augustus's own daughter, Julia, was caught in adultery under her father's own law. He exiled her to the small Mediterranean island of Pandateria, where she lived out her remaining years in disgrace. In 9 AD, Augustus and the Senate tried again. The Lex Papia Papea expanded the original laws, closed some of the loopholes, increased the penalties, and lengthened the rewards. It was named after the 2 consuls who proposed it. Both of them were unmarried bachelors. The Romans noticed. For the next 300 years, these laws remained on the books. They were modified, expanded, and occasionally enforced. They were also, as the centuries passed, gradually circumvented, ignored, and finally, quietly repealed under Christian emperors who found their punitive structure incompatible with their new theology. The result of the entire legislative project across 3 centuries was almost nothing. Senatorial birth rates did not recover. The old Roman families continued to go extinct, generation after generation. By the time the empire reached its peak under Trajan and Hadrian, the senatorial class was being replenished not by Roman reproduction, but by elevation of provincials, Spaniards, Gauls, North Africans, into the patrician ranks. The men who ruled Rome by the 2nd century AD were increasingly not Romans by ancestry. They were Romans by promotion. Augustus had legislated. He had incentivized. He had punished. And his own class, the class he was trying to save, kept refusing to reproduce. Modern historians have spent a long time trying to understand why Augustus failed. The simple answer is that he was trying to legislate against the consequences of his own success. The Roman peace he created, the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative stability, was the very condition that made his elite reluctant to reproduce. Prosperity and security made children optional. Optional children, in any society that has ever achieved them, become fewer children. The deeper answer is that the laws were addressing the wrong problem. Augustus assumed that Romans were not having children because they had become lazy, decadent, or morally corrupt. His laws were designed to push them back into a virtuous state through shame, punishment, or restored honor. He believed the problem was moral. The problem was structural. Wealthy Romans were not having children because, in their world, children had become a net cost rather than a net benefit. On a Roman farm in 200 BC, a child was an asset, extra hands, a future inheritor of the land, a guarantee of care in old age. In urban Rome in 20 BC, a child was a liability, an expense, a complication, a constraint on freedom. The economic logic had reversed, and no amount of legislation could reverse it. You cannot legislate a society into wanting children when the underlying economic structure makes children expensive. You can subsidize them, you can punish those who refuse to have them, and hand out medals to families of 3. None of these will change the basic calculation that an urban woman in Rome, or in Seoul, Tokyo, or Milan, is making when she decides whether to have a child. The cost to her career, freedom, finances, body, and relationships. She is asking whether the society she lives in will support her if she becomes a mother, or whether it will quietly punish her for it. Whether she can afford to live where she works, whether her partner will share the burden, or whether her own parents will still be alive to help. In Rome, the answer was usually no. In modern South Korea, the answer is also usually no. The conditions are different. The math is the same. Augustus did not understand this. The South Korean government does not understand this. Both reached for the same tool, financial incentives and social pressure, and both discovered that the tool does not work on a problem that is not really about money. This is the pattern. A society achieves prosperity, urbanization, and individual freedom. But prosperity, urbanization, and individual freedom together produce a side effect almost nobody planned for. They make children optional, in a way they have not been in any previous human society. In every previous society, children were necessary. For labor, for old age security, for survival itself. The new society makes children a choice. And once children are a choice, a significant portion of the population begins to choose differently. And the choice is not selfish, as Augustus believed. It is not the product of moral decay, as the Romans of the 2nd century AD complained. It is the rational response of free people to a set of incentives that no longer reward reproduction. In urban prosperity, the individual cost of a child has risen dramatically, while the individual benefit has collapsed. People do the math, and they conclude that one child is sufficient, or that no children is also a valid life. The collective consequences are catastrophic. The society ages, workforce shrinks, the military cannot recruit, the economy contracts. The political class panics and reaches for solutions. The solutions do not work. Augustus tried laws. Modern South Korea has tried money, over $270 billion of it. Japan has tried matchmaking programs and dating subsidies. Italy has tried cash bonuses. China has reversed the one-child policy and is now begging citizens to have 3. All of them are running into the same wall the Roman Empire ran into 2,000 years ago. The individual calculation that produces declining birth rates is downstream of the basic structure of modern, prosperous urban life. You cannot legislate the calculation away while leaving the structure intact. Rome did not solve its demographic problem. It survived it for a while, by importing population. The senatorial class was replenished from the provinces. The legions were filled with non-Italian recruits. The cities of Italy emptied out in some regions and were repopulated by migrants from elsewhere in the empire. This worked for a few centuries, until it didn't. By the 5th century AD, the western half of the Roman Empire was overwhelmingly populated by people whose grandparents had not been Romans, and it could no longer hold itself together as a single political entity. Modern societies facing demographic collapse are now reaching for the same solution. Immigration is filling the population gap that domestic reproduction is leaving. This is not a moral question. It is a structural observation. South Korea, which has historically been one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries on Earth, is now actively recruiting foreign workers. Japan, which spent decades resisting immigration, is now expanding it. Germany, Italy, Spain, the United Kingdom, Canada are running on demographic deficits that domestic reproduction cannot fill. The Roman example suggests that this can work for a long time. The Roman example also suggests that the social and political stresses produced by replacing your population through immigration are real, and that they accumulate and eventually become difficult to manage. Augustus died in 14 AD, 23 years after passing his marriage laws. He had spent his entire reign trying to make Romans reproduce. He had failed. The laws he wrote remained on the books for another 3 centuries, accomplishing very little, and were eventually repealed by emperors who recognized that they could not legislate desire. What Augustus could not see is that he was trying to solve a problem that no society has ever solved through state action. We can see it. Once prosperity makes children optional, the only reliable way to raise birth rates appears to be a collapse in prosperity. So also is the kind of religious revival that subordinates individual choice to collective obligation. Neither of these is a solution any modern society is prepared to choose. The Roman story does not tell us what to do. It tells us what does not work, not the subsidies or the punishments. It tells us that medals, tax breaks, and parental leave are helpful at the margins, but cannot reverse a trend that is downstream of the entire structure of modern life. It also tells us that the trend is survivable for a while. The Roman Empire lasted 4 centuries past the point at which its elite stopped reproducing. It survived by importing people, elevating provincials, and by adapting. Modern societies will do something similar. Some of them will do it well, others will not. But all will be changed by it. The people in Augustus's Rome could not see what they were doing. They could not see that the prosperity they had built was the thing that was unmaking them. We have their example. We can. This is what this channel does. We find the pattern. We use the past to see the present clearly, because history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And once you can hear the rhyme, the news stops feeling random. It starts feeling like a song you've heard before. If this video found you, hit subscribe. There's more coming. I'll see you in the next one.